Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Andrea Gittleman, and I'm the Policy Director at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Welcome to today's discussion, Ethiopian Voices on Current Mass Atrocity Risks. The Holocaust Museum teaches that the Holocaust was preventable and that by heeding warning signs and taking early action today, individuals and governments can save lives. With this knowledge, the museum's Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide works to do for the victims of genocide today what the world failed to do for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. The center's mandate is to alert the U.S. national conscience, influence policymakers, and stimulate worldwide action to prevent and work to halt acts of genocide and related crimes against humanity and advance justice and accountability. The 2 years of conflict between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front spiraled into a horrific episode of mass atrocity and humanitarian crisis that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives and where all parties have committed mass atrocities. We saw atrocities flamed and fueled by hate speech and hateful rhetoric. Last October, during a particularly precarious moment, the museum issued a statement expressing concerns about further crimes against humanity and a heightened risk of genocide in Ethiopia's Tigray region. We welcome the November cessation of hostilities agreement between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF, which has resulted in a significant drop in violence. Despite the significance of this peace deal, civilians remain at risk of atrocities and require ongoing vigilance by the international community. There have been reports that civilians continue to be targeted by regional militias and Eritrean forces despite the peace agreement, and several hurdles remain, including implementation of the Transitional Justice policy to deliver accountability for the victims of atrocities across the country. And indeed, the situation in the Oromia region continues to be particularly worrying. Last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken released the State Department's atrocity determination on Ethiopia, which is something Ethiopian civil society leaders, civil society writ large, and the museum had repeatedly requested. Secretary Blinken determined that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, the Tigray People's Liberation Front forces, and Amhara forces committed war crimes during the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Also that members of the ENDF, EDF, and Amhara forces committed crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and persecution. The secretary noted that members of the Amhara forces also committed the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer and committed ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray. Given the severity of the crimes and the immense impact on victims, we at the Simon-Skjodt Center want to focus on ongoing risks to civilians and their demands for justice. We are honored today to be joined by speakers from the Tigrayan, Oromo, and Amhara communities and a leading international expert who will discuss the current situation, risks of atrocities, and what justice means for them. Today, we are joined by Bisrat Gebra-Michael, who is the Chief Marketing Officer at Omna Tigray. Also, Sina Jimjimo, the Executive Director of the Oromo Legacy Leadership and Advocacy Association. Zola Mogiz, an international lawyer who will speak about the situation facing the Amhara community. And Will Davison, International Crisis Group's Ethiopia Senior Analyst. Following our panel discussion, we will answer questions that have been submitted in advance by our audience. So thank you to all panelists today for joining us and for sharing your experience. We'll jump right in. My first question is for Bisrat. Can you speak about some reflections you have on the current risks facing Tigrayans after the cessation of hostilities agreement? And do you have any reactions to Secretary Blinken's atrocity determination from last week?
Yeah, so first, thank you, Andrea, for the introduction and for giving us the opportunity to be here. So as a quick note, Omna Tigray is a nonprofit that's focused on advocacy and documentation in support of Tigrayans. And to your question around current risks, I mean, I'll probably break this out maybe humanitarian risks as well as security risks. And on the humanitarian side, we've definitely seen some progress in getting aid to Tigray as a peace agreement, but there's still a really huge demand for civilians, many of whom have yet to return home. So there's one issue around access into Tigray with at least 2 of the humanitarian corridors that are being blocked by Amhara forces, and there's also security concerns that are preventing aid into getting into Western Tigray as well as Northern Tigray. And then outside of the access issue, there's also a distribution issue because there's a lack of cash for transport or a lack of an administrative structure in some of these towns. And then you also have those who are also outside of Tigray. I mean, you have tens of thousands of former Tigrayan Ethiopian National Defense Force soldiers who, if they're still alive, are languishing in prisons across Ethiopia, as well as those who are refugees in various parts of the Horn, who are also becoming increasingly victims of human trafficking to Libya. And so that kind of paints a picture on the humanitarian side. I do want to get into the security risks, particularly focusing around Western Tigray, Southern Tigray, and Northern Tigray. And I'll start off with Western Tigray and saying that atrocities are very much still ongoing. In Alemti, we're hearing of abduction, rape, and looting by Amhara forces to this very day. We're also hearing new rounds of ethnic cleansing, people being displaced. I mean, as of last week, we've been hearing of new arrivals of IDPs, internally displaced peoples, that are coming from Welkite into Shida Shirado area that are being displaced, but also very much fearful of a new round of killings. So as Tigrayans are being displaced, we're hearing that new Amhara civilians are being brought in, which is speculated as an attempt to change the population statistics in the event of any, constitutional procedures that could potentially settle disputes on Western Tigray. We're also hearing of Tigrayans being given Amhara ID cards in both Western Tigray as well as Southern Tigray to falsely change their identity. And then also in Southern Tigray, we're hearing of similar stories of looting by Amhara forces as well. And so as all of this is happening, there are also reports of military training of new Amhara and Eritrean force recruits and more Eritrean forces that are also moving into Western Tigray from Eritrea. We're hearing that about 5 villages or so are under Eritrean troops, are occupied by Eritrean troops in northwestern Tigray. And so with all this considered, I mean, there's really a lot of concern about what's happening in Western Tigray and rumors that we're gearing up for another round of war, if not some more grave atrocities. So that paints a picture on Western Tigray. If you also kind of move towards Northern Tigray, in Irob, first I'll say that the Irob people are a minority group, and we truly fear for their extinction. They sit on the border with Eritrea, and their land is very much still being occupied. And here we're also hearing of similar atrocities, so abductions, sexual violence, displacement, etc. And mind you, it's also another place where there hasn't been much aid access. So Eritrean forces are very much increasing in size here and also reportedly trying to take control of some of these towns. So all this to say, I mean, violations are still very much ongoing. Just because a peace deal was signed, doesn't mean that we should be moving past Ethiopia just yet. And then your question around the Secretary Blinken's atrocity determination report. So I'll briefly say here that I do welcome the recognition of atrocities and also pointing out the perpetrators. And as he mentioned, the parties did commit war crimes, and in particular, Ethiopian forces, Eritrean forces, Amhara forces committed crimes against humanity, which is a more systematic campaign against the Tigrayan people. And while recognizing all of this, I do personally think that it does fall short of calling it a genocide. I mean, there's been a clear intent to wipe out Tigrayans, which has been indicated in many conversations with senior diplomats, the EU envoys Pekka Haavisto, in the media. You hear of Tigrayan women who are being raped, their uterus is burned, and their perpetrators are telling them that they're preventing them from having any more Tigrayan babies. So it truly makes me question, are we truly naming all of the atrocities that happened over the past 2 years by the correct name? Or are we just, placing salt on a wound to survivors and victims by being fearful of the highly politicized nature of the term genocide? Like, are we limiting the scope of justice here? And then there's some people who will say, well, we haven't been able to get into Tigray to truly analyze intent. And I think that's really just a cause for doing more to push for access in a much more meaningful way. Very quick last point here. I also do want to point out that in response to this determination, Ethiopia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs did publish a statement that essentially said, they don't accept the condemnations, and as according to them, it also gets in the way of the peace process. And if you also carefully notice, a lot of their messaging as of recently has been around at least any international efforts for justice and accountability being framed as a blocker to the peace process. So with a government that's generally this hostile, it truly makes me doubtful of their commitment to justice, transitional justice more so, and doubtful that they'll even protect civilians as well.
Thank you, Visra. I think you stated very clearly that there ample reasons to be concerned about the welfare of civilians in Tigray. That even after the cessation of hostilities agreement, you are still describing these horrific abuses that are continuing to take place, and certainly something that we need to keep watching. I think you said it well when we can't consider the conflict over, that we still need to watch how civilians might be faring. And yes, I thank you for your comments on the atrocity determination. I think it's important to think about what these kind of forms of recognition can do, and what also still is needed. And your point about needing to continue to investigate and collect information is important. A lot of the groups here are responsible for collecting information. The reason why we know what we do is because of really important civil society actors who have been carefully and at great risk documenting what is happening. And I think that's a credit to the overall community across the country who has been doing this work. I'd like to turn to Sina because we are receiving worrying news about escalating violence in the Oromo region. And I was hoping you could please discuss the situation facing communities there, and any suggestions you have about how to address the atrocity risks that are facing civilians.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thanks so much for the whole team for putting this together. I think, Holocaust Museum as leader into prevention of genocide have responsibility and explain its role in making sure genocide don't happen, and then if there is a warning, that to possibly be ahead and do something about it. And I think in terms of my sister here, in terms of what's happening in the northern part of Ethiopia, she have painted a decent picture, and also the international community is much more aware about it. But the fact of the matter is, Andrea, the conflict in Ethiopia was long before the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia, particularly in Tigray. The hallmark or the risk factor, the main three risk factor, the even Holocaust Museum put out is the height of conflict, ideology. The three main things that really triggers genocide have been there in Ethiopia. Soon after, the change have came by December 2018. There's been conflict in Oromia. 5 months before the conflict in Tigray, there was the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa that led to the killing of hundreds of people. By Ethiopian government account, over 300 people within about 24 hours frame, and 9,000 people were arrested. By opposition figure, that is in thousands, and over 100,000 were arrested. The conflict in Oromia is, the challenge with the conflict in Oromia is, with everybody is aware about what's happening in the Tigray area, or particularly in the northern part, but the war started long before in Tigray, and is still ongoing. That's not being discussed, and it is absolutely important that Holocaust Museum, the international community, takes a look at the bigger picture. What really led to this? The question that I think we're talking here is like, how did we get this, and was there any signs that we could have done something? I think there was a signs that how Amnesty International published a report in May 29, 2020 about mass arrest, extrajudiciary killing, village burning by Ethiopian security force, and particularly by Oromia regional government. All of this was happening, but they were not called out on it. The government had all the signs that shows that it's turning against people, and then also the hate between the group and government is possibly, we suspect that the government have hands in it, instigating conflict between ethnic groups. We've seen, as everybody know, what's happening. The Secretary of State, the determination of what happened in Tigray, we've seen how the intention was there bluntly for everybody to hear and to see. But even before that, and as we speak today, even what happened over just a few days ago in DC, when the Amhara National Convention took place, in using certain language that creates hate between groups. And I think it is very important that the international community takes back and look into whether they assign warning. If so, what can we do? And I think that's one thing is to pay attention, is that the signs were there. On the other hand, I also wanted to talk about the security risk factor were there. I think I've kind of covered that part. 5 months before and a whole year before the conflict in Tigray, the issue was that there was an incident of in December 21st, 2021, the security force killed 14 religious leaders from Karayum. just a few weeks ago, at least about 4 people were killed by security force in Guji area. And then just right now as we speak, the Amhara Fanos have crossed into western part of Oromia, perpetuating this violence. But obviously there's also a report of the oil perpetuating violence as well that we see. But it's really hard to kind of know who is perpetuating what when there is no international organization or international media or international independent bodies there to kind of say who is committing. And when the government especially say, I haven't OLA commit this and OLA denies, but then obviously in the case of the Amhara Fano, that have been documented what they have done in there. It's going on as we speak. In terms of implementation of, I think, peace agreement, I think we're going to come back to that one if I'm not mistaken. Let me give it back to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sina. And I appreciate that you focused on the early warning signs. As we know, mass atrocities never emerge out of the ether. They're never spontaneous. There are always early warning signs. And I'll be interested in keeping this as part of the conversation to know what those signs were and what kind of responses did we see and what could have been done. When we see crimes on this scale, we know that there has been a failure to prevent on all sides. So I appreciate you focusing on those early warning signs. Now I'll turn to Zola. Zola, as a member of the Amhara community, can you please reflect on the situation facing Amharas in Ethiopia and the support needed to protect civilians from future atrocities?
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. In terms of risk of atrocities, the Amharas are one of the most vulnerable ethnic groups in Ethiopia. In fact, I would say that there is no other ethnic group in Ethiopia, in current Ethiopia, facing a great risk of atrocities, including genocide, as the Amharas. There are multiple reasons why the Amharas are so vulnerable. And I'm going to mention at least 4 reasons why Amharas are at a great risk of atrocities. The first one is geographical dispersion. The Amharas are is the second largest group in terms of number. Nevertheless, more than 10 million of Amharas live outside their home region. They are found scattered across the country. And this has made them particularly vulnerable to targeted ethnic attacks as they don't have concentrated population to provide a collective self-defense. Many Amharas live, for example, in Oromia region. More than half of the 10 million live in Oromia region. And in this region, which has increasingly become a graveyard for many Amharas, Oromo regional government forces, Oromo opposition armed groups, including the OLA, Oromo Liberation Army, and including those political elites, Oromo political elites, have been treating Amharas as outsiders, aliens. We should go back to their home, even if they were born and have lived in the region for generations. This is one main reason why Amharas are vulnerable for atrocities. The second is there is this false narrative that the Amharas are the oppressor group which enjoyed privileges in the past. This narrative, which has been mainly advanced by Tigrayan nationalists and Oromo nationalists, starting from 1950s, which paints the Amharas as the oppressor group, which has dominated other ethnic groups, despite the fact that the Amharas themselves have also been victims of discrimination and violence. This narrative is very concerning, deeply concerning, because history has shown us again and again that false narratives of this kind, which portrays one religious, one ethnic group as a privileged group, as an oppressor, is a precursor to mass atrocities. For example, if we see the case of the European Jews in the 1930s and the Tutsis in early 1990s, there was this false narrative which portrayed them as a privileged group. So the same is happening in Ethiopia. And the third factor which makes the Amhara situation very concerning is that these narratives have been sponsored by governments. For example, the TPLF government, the Tigrayan Liberation Front, which dominated politics in the country, in its original political manifesto, explicitly stated that the Amharas are the enemies of Tigrayans. When they used the state apparatus, the state machinery, and the constitution in order to analyze, this still continues to exist up to date. Government-sponsored violence and identification. Over the last 60 years, Amaras have been subjected to state-sponsored classification, dehumanization, and persecution. And in the past 30 years, specifically, they have experienced institutionalized marginalization, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, especially in Oromia region and in Benishangul regions, where most Amaras still which makes Amharas particularly vulnerable is the international community's lack of appreciation of the plight of the Amhara people. Amhara's marginalization over the past few decades has meant that they did not have the diplomatic and media networks to put across their stories of suffering and persecution to the international community. They are among the poorest people, even unable to hire lobbyists and people in the mainstream media to influence public opinion and foreign policy at the international level. The international community has largely accepted the false narratives advanced by the Tigrayan and Oromo nationalists without understanding the gravity of the Amhara's suffering. And this has further exacerbated the vulnerability of the Amaras to mass atrocities. The vulnerability of the Amhara ethnic group in Ethiopia is not a hypothetical situation, I should emphasize, but it is a grim reality that we see on a daily basis in current Ethiopia. In the recent years alone, Amharas have already experienced unimaginable ethnic-based mass killings and displacement, as documented by the joint investigation report of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and Amnesty International reports, as well as human rights. This is suffering. Despite this, as I said, the Amhara don't have the resources in order to influence lobbyists and policymakers. And I would like to mention some cases, documented facts, that in November 2020, just before the civil war erupted, about 200 innocent Amharas were killed by Oromo forces in Walaga. And in the preceding weeks, thousands, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of Amaras were killed and hundreds of thousands were displaced from Oromia and Benishangul regions. Additionally, the joint report showed that about 700 daily laborers, and it was confirmed by Amnesty International, were killed by Tigrayan militias in what is called Western Tigray, but the Amharas refer it as the Walgait region because in the past, before 1991, it was a land occupied by the Amharas. So in that area, just after the war erupted, more than 700 daily laborers were killed, and this was confirmed by the joint investigation report. And currently, according to the UN Office for Humanitarian Coordination, there are over 1 million internally displaced people in Amhara due to the conflict. Most of them, they have been expelled from Oromia region. The World Food Program reports that about 13.6 million people need food assistance. Out of this, more than 6 million are from Amhara region, and nobody is talking about it. Many people are still fixated on the conflict in Tigray, and people talk about the suffering of the Tigrayans. Yes, there have been suffering in Tigrayans, but also in the Amhara region. As we speak, thousands of Amaras also being evicted. As we speak, just on a daily basis, they are being evicted from Oromia region. Other even being prevented from entering the capital city, Addis Ababa. It's very strange. Even today, the Prime Minister was asked in the what the mayor has been saying, that the Amaras, there are people coming from some regions which want to who want to overthrow the government. So this is just one way of designating a particular group of people as a security threat to the state. This is a precursor to mass atrocities. Therefore, in short, we can say that the Amaras people, the atrocities inflicted upon the Amhara ethnic group are not merely a possibility, but earth-breaking reality, and the international community must not turn a blind eye to their suffering. Finally, I would like to note that many innocent people are dying in Ethiopia, not only Amharas, but also Oromos, Tigrayans, and other people. They have been dying over the last 5 years. What makes the Amaras killing, mass atrocities, so particular so unique is that they have been killed because of their identity. As we see, when the war came to an end after the conclusion of the peace agreement, there are no reported killings. At least there are no known killings of Tigrayans, because it was a political problem. But if you see the Amhara situation, the Amharas have been killed despite the fact that they haven't been involved even in politics, innocent people. So that is what makes them particularly vulnerable, and their suffering particularly unique in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Zola, for sharing. I think it's important to remember that multiple groups are at risk of mass atrocities in Ethiopia and have experienced mass atrocity crimes. I would just note that all members of these groups have been targeted on the basis of their ethnicity. And that's something that I think has been a really disturbing feature of the past 2 years, but also I think more broadly. So thank you, Zola. I also think this idea of identity-based targeting is something that permeates the broader conflict, is extremely concerning. I'd like to now ask Will, given your work, I was hoping you could speak about the broader national political context and the motivations of various groups today, political groups or armed groups, and specifically, what should we watch regarding future atrocity risks?
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thanks for this opportunity. I just wanted to build on your responses there, and I think it'd be interesting to hear from Zola how the Tigrayan and widespread perception that the Tigrayans were targeted on the basis of their ethnicity during the war en masse, systemically, how that actually differs in a substantive way from the way that he thinks that Amharas have been treated. And also, I mean, and perhaps the other panelists would like to speak to this, but the identifying of a particular ethnic group as all powerful and singling them out is not something that's just been applied to the Amhara elite, but also has been something which has notably been applied to the Tigrayan elite, and increasingly to the Oromo elite. And it'll be interesting to get Zola's reflections on that. And I think really what we have already in this discussion is a representation of the broader political problem, as you've noted, which is that the ethnic and other targeting with violence goes in several different directions and is accompanied by narratives of grievance and victimhood, which are shared or different narratives of the same type promoted by the different groups. And that speaks to the type of political and ethnic rivalry in Ethiopia that lies at the root of the violence. And this is why people such as ourselves at International Crisis Group, but many others, including many Ethiopians, often hark back to the idea of a national dialogue or a similar process to try and discuss some of these differing historical narratives, differing contemporary narratives, to try and come to some sort of agreement between Ethiopians of different perspectives, so that there is not such a focus on the crimes that are being committed against those that people sympathize and identify with the most, but you can try and establish some sort of consensus and process of inquiry and justice with that. Now, in terms of the current situation, I think a lot of it's contained in the previous comments. In terms of atrocity risks, if we return to Bizrat's comments, understandably, a lot of that was focused on the situation and the crimes that are being committed in Western Tigray and the ongoing dangers there. And as often with these types of situation, at the root, or the key context is a political disagreement. And although we've seen huge progress that I think everyone recognizes in terms of the Pretoria Peace Agreement and the achievements that's made in reducing large-scale fighting, almost everyone recognizes that it hasn't solved a lot of the political issues that led to the war, and those that have arisen during the war, the disagreements. And prominent among that is the fact that Amhara region and entities from Amhara have claimed what has been a portion of Tigray throughout the federal era since the 1990s as their own. They have forcibly taken control of this area, saying that it was rightfully Amhara land and it should never have been part of Tigray. And it is within that political demand and campaign that these atrocities have been committed. The Pretoria Peace Agreement has substantively done nothing to resolve that dispute between, let's say, the Amhara and Tigray political communities. Instead, what it has done is create the impression, the perception amongst various Amhara actors, and again, maybe Zola can speak to this, that the federal government, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, may have tacitly, let's say, backed the Amhara position on this territory. But now, with the essentially a political pact with the TPLF that is at the heart of the Pretoria deal, that the Prime Minister and his federal government is perhaps sympathetic that these areas should be restored to Tigray as they were prior to the outbreak of the war. It is this uncertainty and ongoing dispute between these political elements, primarily Amhara and Tigray political elements, that carries the risk of future violence, and within that future violence, future atrocities in areas such as Western Tigray. And these are therefore the areas where Ethiopians and other interested actors need to pay the closest attention to try and prevent a repeat of the type of atrocities we've seen. We've also spoken about the ongoing situation in Oromia, including the problem that the huge problem that Zola so passionately articulated about the vulnerability of minority Amhara communities in Oromia, who are suffering amid a sort of ongoing insurgency, counterinsurgency situation, with the Oromo Liberation Army fighting the insurgency and various government authorities responding in a brutal fashion. That unresolved political dispute at the heart of the ongoing conflict in Oromia, and the vulnerability, particularly of those pockets of Amhara communities, represents a massive ongoing conflict risk in Ethiopia. And unless we see some sort of truce turning into a political discussions, maybe broadening into the national dialogue between the Oromo Liberation Army and the government, between Oromo nationalist elements and Amhara nationalist elements, which have completely different views of Ethiopia's history and where the country should go, then it is likely that the political conflict will continue, and we still have the same risks of atrocities. I'll stop there, but maybe just a quick word about Secretary Blinken's recent announcement. It was too late. And I think the fact that it was something like 2 years too late speaks to the inadequacies of the international system in actually being able to realistically prevent atrocities in places like Ethiopia. The fact that we are having this type of discussion today, and we will be talking about the various slightly unlikely ways, quite frankly, that justice can be achieved in Ethiopia, either through national or international processes, also speaks to the inadequacy of the international community, and the very late atrocity determination, which seems to be the product of some intra-administration bargaining, perhaps, at a time when really the US and its partners are looking to re-engage and be supportive of the government in Addis. Again, I think that highlights the difficulties of achieving accountability and justice and really meaningfully impacting the political situation in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. I think you gave us a lot to think about in terms of what we need to keep watching in terms of the international community and where we might see future atrocities. And you also, I think, are leading us into the second part of our conversation, which is about demands for justice and accountability. And I mean, I understand your expressions of pessimism. And I think often when you have crimes of this scale, it's often difficult to think about what genuine accountability will look like in the near term.
I'll try and say something more positive later, but I think it is important to be realistic as well.
I think that's very fair, and I think in a number of situations we have seen justice is often difficult, and really it's victims, survivors from a number of communities. Often when they come together to kind of keep the pressure on the international community to make sure that there are advancements for justice and accountability, and groups here and groups in the broader space from Ethiopia who have been working on this. I think a lot of credit is to them for making sure that the world continues to pay attention to the need to have justice for the mass atrocities committed. In that vein, I might turn to Besrat again. I would be interested in your thoughts on what justice means for you and to the Tigrayan community, to the extent that you can speak about that, and what can be done to make sure that the transitional justice policy takes into account the needs of victims and survivors in Tigray.
Yeah, so we've been asking a variety of Tigrayans and beginning some of this research also in terms of like what justice means to them. And this is for Tigrayans that are within Tigray as well as in some of the refugee areas. And I think at a higher level, a majority of Tigrayans that I've spoken to, at least a number of us have spoken to, don't want revenge. Like they want justice. And so justice for some means going home, getting their lives back. For a refugee that's in Sudan, they want to go back to their homes in Western Tigray, Northwestern Tigray, et cetera, and be able to live there peacefully, not being targeted or killed just for their identity. Many others also want to see criminal accountability, meaning that the perpetrators are facing charges in court and finally feeling validated that this atrocity happened to them, that we also believe them. I mean, for the mother who brought a child into this world and isn't able to do anything to stop starvation, seeing their bones through their flesh, we just can't let these perpetrators go without being held accountable. So we're beginning these discussions right now about what the options could look like, but we're thinking about justice in a pretty comprehensive package to really ensure that there is in fact lasting peace, and they're also reassuring that there is non-reoccurrence of atrocities as well. And so first, I think as part of this, it's about making sure that the peace agreement goes into full implementation, which also entails the protection of civilians, withdrawal of Amhara and Eritrean forces. And so when we talk about justice and paving the way towards that, it's also important that the international community does its part in ensuring that any funding or other resources to Ethiopia is also assessed based off of key principles that genuinely places civilians at the core. So in December, the EU laid out some of these principles in deciding whether it re-engages with Ethiopia. The US has its own standards. So it's really about making sure that we're sticking to these and not prematurely rewarding the Ethiopian government. And then after that, it's also about making sure that, we're supporting the UN mandated International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, ICRI, is what I've heard it's been called, which is tasked with an impartial investigation in Ethiopia. So making sure that they also do get access into the country to do some truth telling, set the facts straight, et cetera. Also, as well as a forensic investigation here too. And then after this, the biggest ask really is in really getting an ad hoc regional tribunal or some level of criminal investigations where we can see accountability in the court of law. I think with all of the different points that Tigrayans have mentioned here, it's really important that we do focus on some of these international processes for accountability to make sure that that we're looking at justice in a much more comprehensive way, and also to the needs of the Tigrayan community as well. And then lastly, to your point on transitional justice and some of the Tigrayan needs, I will first start off by saying that, you know, at the end of the day, transitional justice is a good thing, right? We want to focus on accountability. We also want to focus on reconciliation. But the Ethiopian government has just been going about it in some pretty biased ways that place a lot of doubt in this process. So for it to truly work, we truly do need to see some sort of political will from the Ethiopian government to drive an honest and encompassing process. So for one, if you've looked at the transitional justice policy options, it primarily centers on reconciliation with a small bit on prosecution. And it also seems that they're leading towards the use of selected members from existing institutions to lead this process. So it could be groups like the police or the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission who have contributed to the war in one way or another. It could have been through some of the mass arrests via the police or inaccurate or misleading information. The other thing to note here is that this framework is largely being led by elites, and at least I personally have not heard of Tigrayans being involved in even conception of this framework or other Ethiopian victims. So to really be victim-centered, they should be involving victims from the very beginning, like not just the second or third phase of the process. I think at a higher level also, when it comes to some of these different focus areas, the Ethiopian government is also really great at making a big deal about hot topics that people seem to care about. So it was transitional justice back in 2018, then it became a discussion around national dialogue over the past 2 years. And then we're here again in 2023 talking about transitional justice. And then you see that all of these committees were created, they get some great press. And then after that, we just don't have any understanding of what happens to these committees or what the follow through even looks like with their commitments. We're lacking any transparency or any understanding of like what the mandate actually is. So for example, you know, there was an interministerial task force that was created to support justice accountability efforts in 2021, but we still don't really have an idea of what they're doing or how they're fitting with some of these new committees that are being created for transitional justice, nor do we have really much of an understanding of what's happening with the national dialogue anymore. And so all is considered, it's very hard to trust the Ethiopian government to deliver on transitional justice because right now they're minimizing it to just a buzzword. We should also note that this will be a pretty unique reconciliation process considering the government and the people are still very much at odds with each other. It's not victor's justice. So to be quite frank, I mean, Tigrayans don't trust the Ethiopian government as one of the main perpetrators to deliver justice. I mean, you can think of it as like a bank robber trying to be in charge of the bank, right? So transitional justice, for it to truly work, the international community should play a heightened role in ensuring the Ethiopian government has the political will to see a truly just process. So far, we're not seeing that, and it's still early, so who knows? But we should be parallel pathing this with other justice options to ensure that Tigrayans get the justice they deserve, and that Eritrea gets held accountable as well, considering that the justice process will likely only focus on like national efforts versus more international scope, or regional scope rather. And I think outside of that also, it's about making sure that a lot of different organizations get the support that they need in terms of documentation. And this includes civil society organizations as well as like within Tigray, as well as those that are outside and abroad.
Thank you, Bisrat. I think you laid out a lot for us. That's a comprehensive understanding of what justice means for people in Tigray, and you're stirring a description of a woman with a child who is starving, and then not by accident, but by design. It's especially horrific, and also kind of makes us wonder what justice looks like for that family, for that woman, and what would she want to see. Your notes at the end, I think documentation efforts by civil society certainly need to be supported, and that I think this is a drive that I think will have to be, long-term in nature, because the pursuit of justice, as we all know, takes a long time. And you mentioned that the commission, the International Commission on Human Rights Experts, and it's a question of whether the mandate would be renewed come September. But I think having that kind of focus on information collection and preservation is extremely important, especially given the risks that all of us have just been hearing about. I'll turn to Sina. I was hoping you could speak about how actors, so that would be governments, but also human rights organizations, civil society, how can actors support the delivery of justice and accountability for crimes in Oromia?
Thank you, Andrea. I think before I really talk about the actors, I want to go back a little bit. I think here is the challenge, Andrea, with the Oromo community. So the international community is talking about the conflict in Tigray, as if that's the only conflict that is happening. And Secretary of State, went to Ethiopia talking about transitional justice. How are we going to talk about transitional justice? Transition from what to what when there is ongoing conflict, ongoing atrocity happening in Oromia against Oromos? Important thing to remember is that it's really, really important that to step back and look at the big picture before we get to Tigray, what was happening, and then what is still happening. And then international community have really responsibility not to play double standard, condemning the violence against a certain group, but looking the other way when there is a conflict is against another group. What makes Oromo case very unique and difficult is that right now the conversation is exclusive about Tigray. So how do you make it broader and really have the community or international community understand? The UN investigating, they're saying they are investigating and they have credible atrocity that have taken place and they have put it out there. But yet we're still talking about transitional justice when there is no even peace agreement between the OLA and the federal government. On the other side, Andrea, the important thing to also understand is that the Oromos face atrocity from the federal government. They were hunted down for 4 years since October 2018 by the Oromia regional government that have committed atrocity, including beheading, very graphic thing, and raping boys under the age of 10. And then obviously I'm not even going to mention about the Amhara Fano, because what they have committed in Benishangul Gumuz, what they've committed in Tigray, what they've committed in Oromia is no different. It's the same thing. Beheading and all of that is really something that is documented, but nobody calls them out, because when the atrocity is happening against the Benishangul Gumuz, against the Oromos, it is almost like it is kind of acceptable. And then they also face another atrocity by the Amhara regional government. There is an area called Special Oromia Zone within Amhara region. That is the control under Amhara government, and that government is perpetuating violence along with the Amhara Fano. So it is difficult to talk about transitional justice and accountability when the conflict is ongoing. It is also difficult to talk about Tigray when the conflict is ongoing, but also it's difficult to talk about accountability when there is perpetuation from the government that have committed this, from the Amhara Fano, and then from the Amhara regional government or Oromia regional government. So Oromos face a very unique situation. The international community, they haven't really understood, they haven't grasped into the depth and the wideness of the issue what's happening in Ethiopia. I think if we don't understand how we got to Tigray and where we are today after Tigray, the conflict risk, the atrocity risk will only continue. And I think I wanted to mention that the Oromos account to more than 50% of the Ethiopian population, and their size, population size, and geographical location, as well as the geographical location where they are located, makes it very critical whether Ethiopia will transfer towards peace or instability. I mean, to really, if you're going to have a stable nation or region, you have to look into the Oromo issue. And Oromo and Amhara being the second largest group, the atrocity or the conflict between them is a very serious. I think William mentioned this, that there is really tension is running very, very high. So to really understand the issue in the countrywide is critical to really talking about it, because it plays into the hands of a radical group that the government or maybe the international community is interested only in the justice and the peace agreement, what's happening to on the northern part of the country, when the fire or the war is going until in the southern part of the country. So I think if we are going to talk about justice, we first have to push for cessation of hostility in the Oromia region, and the international community, including the Holocaust Museum, talking about really what's happening to Oromia. What's happening to Oromia is that the Amhara Fano perpetuates this, and everybody perpetuates. So there is no safe haven for Oromo. In the Tigray region, as a Tigray, before obviously the government control, you are safe as a Tigray. If you go to Amhara region, you are pretty much safe if you're an Amhara. But for Oromo, there is no safe haven for the Oromo. Oromos are targeted in the name of being affiliation with Oromo Liberation Army. The government target them. The regional government target them, the Amhara regional government target them, the Fano target them. So it is a really precarious situation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like also what I think the Omna young lady said from Omna Tigray is that what justice look like. So the justice for the Oromo community, there is this frustration that we're not even looking into what's happening. What we're saying is forget the justice and accountability. We are on fire. Put the fire out. And to put the fire out, we have to really do what we say. And you also asked the question in terms of the actors. The actors are varied. I mean, in the case of Oromia, where you have a regional government that's supposed to protect the civilians, are perpetuating this in all parts of Oromia. And then you have the Amhara Fano organized, cross over into the Oromia region, commit what they've committed in Tigray, but they don't get called out by Amhara regional government, by anybody in the international community. Does not seem to be interested. So it is disappointing to see that Secretary of State and even the DRL annual report that just came out, it recognizes that there's really not information in Oromia. What that means is that the government intentionally, the federal government intentionally, is blocking out information from Oromia to reach international community. The international community have a responsibility to look into why is this area blacked out, because we have a news media, news information coming in a conflict area in Tigray, but we have no information over the last 2+ years in the case of Oromia, what all these atrocities happening. If we don't investigate, if we don't look into what's happening to Oromia, if we don't take at the bigger picture, that we're going to continue to perpetuate this violence, and the risk is even more dire because the Oromos are at the point being the largest ethnic group that truly Ethiopia is Oromo, because when you come to Oromia, you see everybody. When you come to Tigray, or when you come to Somalia, when you come to Amhara region, you don't see that kind of diversity. So when these people retaliate, and then it'll be a bigger catastrophe than what's happening in Tigray. So I think the international community must really look into the conflict in a bigger side rather than just focusing in the Tigray area. It's also important that she mentioned about documentation. It is so challenging to even bring any data, any information from Oromia, because the government is so intolerant that if you are caught with the information, you are automatically kicked. Obviously, I mean, then if you are surviving the Oromia government and somehow crossed over or anyway close to the Amhara region, you are beheaded. So it is Oromia is surrounded, in at least to a certain degree, to a certain part, by really dangerous fire in the Amhara side as well as within the Oromo regional government. So I think to hold this perpetrator accountable, first we need to stop the violence across the country and push the government to settle into a negotiated settlement with OLA and any other warring party, and then to have a national dialogue. Really, as the young lady mentioned that a couple of years ago it was transitional justice, and then it was a national dialogue, and the government seemed to take this and then turn it into whatever circus, and then just abandon it and moving on it. They cannot be a justice and accountability, honestly, if the investigation is not done by independent party, and maybe like she mentioned, ad hoc accountability court being set up, not just in Tigray, but actually across the country. Because if we were to move forward in the peace and a stable country, that the justice must come to not just even for Oromo, for Benishangul Gumuz people who don't even have a voice, for Kimans that are within the Amhara region that have been, disseminated. I think we must have honest conversation, and to have honest conversation, we must look into the bigger picture rather than just focus. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Sina, and thank you for encouraging us to have this wider lens, looking at the conflict and at the pursuit of justice. Certainly, when we think about justice, it shouldn't just be as narrow as the transitional justice policy and the particular agreement. I think this is something that everyone who cares about the fate of victims and survivors of mass atrocities in Ethiopia should be trying to pursue in a much wider way. And your point about helping independent documentation, I think, is it's essential, just given the severe restrictions on information access. And also goes back to what was mentioned earlier about the International Commission on Human Rights Experts. So having some kind of an independent international team is really dedicated to doing this work is important, is even more important when other information is so hard to get out. Zola, I'd like to turn to you. What can be done to promote justice in Amhara, and can you talk about some domestic accountability options, or what do you think might be realistic for justice?
Thank you again, Andrea. Before I come to your question, I would like to speak to what William raised earlier. Regarding the question of atrocity, especially what makes the Amharas at risk for atrocity so particular compared to the Tigrayans who were targeted during the war, or the Oromos who are being killed in Wolaga, is the fact that in Oromia and in Tigray, people were being targeted because of the war, which had a political reason. But when you see the Amharas are being just massacred in hundreds, in thousands for their identity. That is the major difference. Yes, the Tigrayans might be targeted they may be arrested because they were, which was wrong. They were suspected of supporting the TPLF, so and so on. But the Amharas, they are being killed not because they are supporting a particular group, rather because they are Amharas. And of course, there have been, as I mentioned in my first intervention, there have been a long-standing narrative which portrays the Amhara people as the oppressor group, the people who oppressed all other ethnic groups. In fact, Ethiopian politics is nothing but a hatred towards Amaras, because every ethnic group, when they start any nationalist movement, any politics, they start by insulting the Amharas, by demonizing the Amharas. Even in our conversation, you see how many times the Amharas are appearing. It's very sad, the victimizers being portrayed as the oppressors, the innocent kids, the innocent women, girls who were raped by TPLF, who were massacred by the Oromo Liberation Army. Even as we speak on a daily basis, those thousands of mothers, lactating mothers, being displaced in Oromia region during a rainy season. It's very, very sad that these people are now being portrayed as the oppressors. Yes, during the war, there were problems. Even maybe from the Amhara side, there were people who might have committed crimes. But what is happening to the innocent Amhara people is unimaginable. You cannot equate it with what has happened to the Tigray. It's not a competition for victimhood, it's a fact. So I would say that the international community first and foremost should understand that the Amharas are not the victimizers. They are the major victims, the main victims at a risk of genocide, at a risk of mass atrocities, which will likely be like what happened to the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. All conditions for genocide are there. There is a narrative, there is identification, there is organization, naming, all conditions are there. And they are widely dispersed, they are spread across the country. And that makes them so vulnerable for any organized attack from other groups, particularly in Oromia region. So that's the first thing that the international community should do. It should understand that the Amharas are at high risk of mass atrocities. The second thing is that now, as you could see from our discussions, everybody claims to be the victim of mass atrocities, which means that we don't have trust even in the existing system, which would be able to deliver accountability. From Amhara's perspective, even if the crime was committed by the Amharas, justice must be served. There is no exception. Whether it's committed by Amharas, committed by Tigrayans, against Amharas, whomsoever committed the crime against whomsoever it is committed, justice must be served. This is the common principle in which the Amhara's mentality is grounded in. So there must be accountability, and that accountability, even if the government is now claiming that it wants to have national ownership, exclusive national ownership over the transitional justice policy, I very much doubt that it will deliver what is expected, because even people are accusing the government of being part of the problem, accusing government forces as the main perpetrators of those mass atrocities. So ideally, it would have been much better to strengthen domestic institutions to deliver justice. But it seems that it's difficult in the current existing situation, since everything is polarized, since everything is challenged. It's very difficult to see perpetrators of mass atrocities being properly investigated, prosecuted, and punished for the crimes that they have committed. So maybe we should consider to have a sort of hybrid system, like hybrid courts, like we have seen in Sierra Leone and other countries. Maybe we should consider that one. But I think more than the accountability for the past atrocities, the international community should really be concerned about what is likely to happen in the near future. The polarization is still there. Security apparatus is now, the government security apparatus is now part of the problem. Ethnic identification, social media insults, they are widespread. And I would like to point out that most of those people who spread hate speech are based in the Western countries, in Europe, in America, in Australia. So let alone to ensure accountability for the past, it's very difficult even to prevent future atrocities unless the international community realizes this fact and controls those people who are in the respective jurisdiction of those states, who are spreading hate speech and breaking the century-old ties, social fabric amongst the society. So that should be a part of the consideration. Of course, truth and reconciliation should also be considered in order to rectify the problems that we have seen between communities.
Thank you, Zola. You've highlighted certainly the numerous hurdles to genuine accountability in the country and the polarization amongst so many groups. Thank you for sharing. I'd like to go to Will now, and I know we're nearing the end of time, but I'd like to go to Will, who could you perhaps speak about some of the international positions and considerations regarding accountability and where you might or might not see support from the international community regarding justice efforts. And then we do have a few questions from the audience that we'll get to if we have time.
Yes, thanks. And I mean, I thought Zola's points were really excellently articulated there. And I think all I would say is I'm just not sure why we're comparing Tigrayan innocent civilian victims to those in Amhara. It just seems to bring an unnecessary insensitivity to the suffering of others, because of course, for example, when hundreds of thousands of innocent Tigrayan civilians were displaced from Western Tigray at the outset of the war, the fact that it's occurring within a war doesn't reduce their suffering at all. So I'm just not sure why Zola, who has such a clear understanding of all of the problems in Ethiopia, the polarization, institutional weakness, etc., and is eloquently outlining this terrible plight for Amhara, innocent Amhara. I'm just not sure why that needs to be put up against or contextualized in a way which seems to sort of downplay the suffering of innocent civilians elsewhere. With regards to the international situation, I commented on it a bit before. We do have a situation where the key international actors, and the US, the EU, other actors, where they are prioritizing the peace agreement and the consolidation of that in Pretoria, trying to achieve similar agreement in Oromia, but also they're trying to prioritize Ethiopia's reconstruction and their own your standard national interests with regards to the regional and geopolitical importance that Ethiopia has. And that means that there is this considerable push to try and normalize relations with Addis, which have really obviously suffered during the war. So, for example, we have an International Monetary Fund technical committee in Ethiopia in preparation to try and restart an IMF lending program to Ethiopia. That would be massive news for the government and potentially for Ethiopia's economic recovery. But there is no indication that the US and their allies' support for a new IMF program in Ethiopia would be conditional upon justice and accountability measures. So this is the type of prioritization that we see from the international community. They're prioritizing peace, they're prioritizing their relations with the government in Addis, and the sort of stabilization of the situation. And the issue there is that it doesn't do anything to address the political problems that Zola and the other panelists have described. And again, despite all the lip service and empty promises with regards to dialogue, national dialogue and transitional justice, this is why we at International Crisis Group, many other like-minded organizations and individuals would like to see Ethiopia's international partners, but also all Ethiopians, try and encourage all of the Ethiopian political actors, particularly the government, to prioritize processes of political negotiation, but also efforts at truth and reconciliation and justice and accountability as part of broader discussions to try and address the political problems that are at the root of this crisis. So whilst we have to be realistic about the power that the federal government has wielded throughout this crisis, and particularly now, and the priorities of its international partners, for Ethiopians' sake and the long-term future of the country, there also needs to be a prioritization of long-term calculations, which means trying to get to the root of the polarization that Zola describes. And obviously, people have different views about how justice and accountability can be balanced and managed with that type of process. But at the very least, we need to see a sincere effort from the government and all Ethiopian political actors to try and address some of these fundamental differences, which we can even see playing out on the panel today.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. And I think these are all things that the international community should keep in mind as we're moving forward. I think the panel has done a lot to bring that out. We have just a couple of minutes left, and we have a few questions that have been submitted by audience members. I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them. So I just want to go back to something, Sina, you had addressed at the front. One of the questions came in asking, were there warning signs before mass atrocities unfolded? And how could the international community have responded to these signs? And Sina, perhaps I'd like to turn to you and then maybe to Will. Sina, because you brought this up, I wanted to give you a chance to think about the warning signs that were present, and then what could have been done that could have perhaps mitigated some of the crimes.
Thank you, Andrea. And for the sake of time, I'll try to be as brief as possible. Yes, I think one of the warning signs, it was the Amnesty International annual report that came on May 29, 2020. On that report, the 51-page document, it shows that mass arrest, village burning, execution in Oromia region. So this tells you 2019, the same year the Prime Minister received a Nobel Peace Prize, that this kind of atrocity was happening against Oromo in the Oromia. Nobody said anything about that. In fast forward 6 months, in June of 2020, there was the assassination of Hachalu. With that, obviously, hundreds of people, by government admission, over 300 people was killed, and 9,000 people were arrested. By opposition and other people, thousands of people were killed, and the country was shut down for 23 days. Internet, everything was shut down. And I think the government, obviously, unfortunately, utilized, instigated ethnic violence to a certain degree, because, the government and the Amhara elites, the Amhara Fano, the Amhara regional government was on one hand against Oromo. So I think what the government did is it used ethnic system to somehow became, an Amhara government against the mass Oromo people. I think so. Those two major incidents, if they have been taken seriously, and in August 2020, 20 members of U.S. Congress wrote a letter to Secretary of State demanding for investigation leading into the surrounding the Hachalu's murder, and then also the really atrocity that took place. This state-sponsored atrocity, and I think I agree with Zola that government have committed a lot of this atrocity. Amhara government obviously playing a very leading role, as well as Amhara Fan, as well as Oromia regional government. And these are very people who have committed. So I think the international community, they should have done it. But I think what they need to do, as William have said right now, is step back, really try to look into. We are leading into this tension right now between the Amhara and Tigray in the northern part of the country. The tension is still very high, and there's also tension is running very high between the Oromo and Amhara, and this can lead to another even bigger mass atrocity that will engulf not just the Horn of Africa, but possibly millions of refugees will be departing the Horn of Africa to go to Europe. So I think with the international community really stepping back and looking into and trying to see, can we prevent the upcoming one while we are also talking about the past.
Thank you, Sina. And I think Bisrat, you wanted to briefly comment, and then I think we'll have to close after that. But Bisrat, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think for the points that were mentioned earlier, I definitely want to note that we shouldn't be minimizing this war in Tigray to just a political war. It was very much designed to attack identity from the very beginning, and that's kind of like some of the signs we saw ahead of the war, largely because a lot of people were conflating TPLF with being Tigrayan, and regardless if Tigrayans even supported TPLF, it shouldn't pave the way for violence towards them. So the clearest sign, I think, before the war was really just around hate speech that was entirely focused, again, on identity. You can see in the media, like federally owned channels, as well as Amhara state channels, it was being spewed by politicians, elites, and the like. And then during the war, we also saw like even more of an escalation in this hate speech, especially online, and that directly translated to real world killings. So there were words being used like cancers, hyenas, etc. And then also before the war, there was some ethnic-based discrimination. There was violence. There were people that were also being killed again due to their Tigrayan identity. And you'd hear it left and right, trying to piece all of this together, just trying to see how all of it kind of like fit in. But again, it was largely just centered around identity. And so the international community, I think, could have done a lot more to prevent the hate speech from circulating, most of which was, on social media platforms, making sure that these platforms really did have the right resources to review content and make sure that they're taking it down in line with their own policies. But outside of that, also making sure that they're using like the right types of like economic, political tools, et cetera, to really hold the government as well as various nationalists and elite accountable. And I think another thing too would have just been like to believe Tigrayans. When you hear one report, it's kind of like, okay, this could be one off. You hear two reports of violence, again, focused around identity, that could be two, like another, again, one off. When you hear like 3, 4, it just becomes a pattern. And so engaging with Tigrayans at that point earlier on, and then bolstering a lot of like documentation efforts of civil society organizations and groups like Human Rights Watch, the museum, who've been documenting some of these early indicators as well, would have been incredibly important then. But I also think it's important to focus on these efforts and strengthening them even now, providing the right types of like technical assistance as well as funding and other types of resources here as well. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but back to you, Andrea.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I know we're at time, but I want to thank all of our speakers for this incredibly important conversation. And thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. In closing, I just want to reiterate, the work of the Simon-Skjodt Center is to make sure that the international community and specific governments can respond in a timely and effective manner when communities are at risk. We have seen this being so ethnically charged, and the violence has been extreme against so many groups. As we've heard today, there are multiple communities that continue to be at risk of mass atrocities. And as has been said, there's no hierarchy of suffering among groups, that all of this needs to stop. I think it also speaks to the challenges of advancing atrocity prevention. And from the conversation today, it seems as though there are a few takeaways. On the justice side, excuse me, that promoting accountability can be a necessary complement of making sure that the cessation of hostilities agreement holds, and pushing against any idea that justice can be forgotten for the sake of peace, or that justice is something that is only for some communities or for some perpetrators. I think we heard that that today. I think this is going to be a long road, and very interested in keeping the conversation going and hearing from our diverse panelists about views about what is necessary in the future. For now, I thank all of you for joining us for this incredibly rich conversation, and know that we, in terms of the Holocaust Museum, Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and other groups across the world who are continue to be very concerned about atrocity risks, will continue monitoring what's happening, and will continue to promote documentation and accountability for these crimes. Thank you all again.